Welcome to the second episode in a Legendarium series about the life and reign of Edward Longshanks. In Part 2, Death of an Empire, we will talk about the events leading up to the Provisions of Oxford in 1258. By his adolescence, Edward Longshanks, who was called Lord Edward rather than Prince Edward, enjoyed his new marriage and independence in Gascony. Yet things were not going well back home in England. King Henry III had enough money to finance a royal lifestyle in peacetime, but his attempts to invade and reconquer France bankrupted him. Despite the ongoing drain on his finances, King Henry III bought up precious stones and shimmering metals. He invested in building and bought every relic he could get his hands on. King Henry III also stockpiled gold, the emerging currency of Christian Europe, in his chambers, living and sleeping among stacks of ingots, gold leaf, and gold dust. He spent so much money that he wound up having to pawn the royal treasure. In time, King Henry III resorted to extorting money from the English Jews and begging Parliament for money. He even installed foreigners as sheriffs, sometimes appointing 3 or 4 sheriffs to one shire, and they competed to raise money. Worst of all, Henry III became dependent on his wife's relations, known as the Lusignans, for loans. Even in a rough and ready world, they became known as haughty, violent, and quarrelsome. Lord Edward returned to England in November 1255 with his household. He settled on the Welsh border, ruled on the English side by the infamous Marcher Lords. Rough and independent noblemen, they cherished freedom from the crown. They also cherished one legend of a Marcher Lord who received a royal dispatch that displeased him, so he forced the royal messenger to eat the message, even the parchment and wax seal. Lord Edward attempted to introduce English administration into Wales, but the Welsh saw English justice as barbaric, requiring hangings where Welsh custom only required fines. So Lord Edward's Welsh subjects appealed to the Prince of Gwynedd, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd. Lord Edward, receiving no help from either his father, King Henry III, or the Marcher Lords, suffered inglorious defeat at the hands of the Welsh. The young Edward's arrogance and his close association with his greedy Lusignan uncles only grew the young lord's unpopularity among the English. Indeed, the Lusignan clique became so brazen that they once ransacked Lambeth Palace, stealing silver and plate, and then retreated with hostages to Farnham Castle. Small wonder that the English grew to hate the Lusignans, who enjoyed royal protection by financing King Henry III. The barons saw Henry III as controlled by his wife's relations, the Lusignans, which kept him from providing even-handed justice. In the medieval understanding, this made him a tyrant, not a king. Even worse, King Henry III became delusional. He dreamed of becoming a great crusader like Richard the Lionheart. In 1254, Pope Innocent IV began hawking the vacant crown of Sicily to the highest bidder, and King Henry III hoped to win it for his second son, Edmund, which would go a long way towards restoring the Plantagenet Empire. Yet with his empty treasury, troubles in Gascony, and his own record of military failure, the lords of England knew that Henry III's proposed invasion of Sicily would be utter folly. As nobles expressed horror at the thought of being bankrupted by this latest adventure, the papal envoy swaggered about England's courts, threatening the country with excommunication if the Lords fail to help King Henry III take Sicily. On top of that, in the summer of 1257, torrential rain killed off the autumn crops and thousands starved. Matthew Paris wrote of that time, "Dead bodies were found everywhere, swollen and livid, lying by 5s and 6s in pigsties or on dunghills or in the muddy streets." On April 30th, 1258, a large group of nobles and their nightly retinues entered the King's Hall at Westminster, their armor clattering and swords clanking on their sides. None other than Simon de Montfort led them. In a shocking act, they did not leave their swords at the door as they entered the royal presence. Though they presented themselves as loyal subjects of the crown, they declared they would no longer tolerate the king's Lusignan subjects or his Sicilian adventure. Simon de Montfort further demanded a council of 24 barons to guide royal government and thrice yearly parliaments where nobles could voice concerns about taxes. Lord Edward, then 18 years old, swore upon the Gospels to do as the Montfort rebels asked. Indeed, Edward came under the influence of Simon de Montfort, a brutal and self-seeking feudal lord who nonetheless had a magnetic personality that overwhelmed lesser men. Given his own father's weakness, it is possible that young Lord Edward saw in Simon de Montfort a stronger and better father figure than what he had. On the other hand, King Henry III did everything he could to wriggle out of what became known as the Provisions of Oxford. These proposals had been drawn up in close consultation with knights from across the shires of England and even Queen Eleanor herself. On October 18, 1258, proclamations in the King name went across England, Gascony, and Eastern Ireland, telling everyone about the new order. Meanwhile, Henry III and his son Lord Edward suffered a personal tragedy. 3-year-old Catherine, Edward's sister, had been born severely disabled and died around the same time of the Oxford crisis. While Henry III disappeared into religious devotion, Lord Edward hoped to preserve royal authority. Unlike his father, Lord Edward showed appetite and ability in war. Edward supported and often joined medieval tournaments, once famously unseating the Count of Chalon in a tournament held in Chalon itself. Yet he could do nothing as rebel barons began calling the shots in how England would be governed. First and foremost, the rebels wanted peace with France, which would be easier on their pocketbooks. To secure it, they accepted that Henry III would pay homage to the French king and renounce any claims to the old Plantagenet Empire once ruled by Henry II. Anjou, Poitou, Maine, and Normandy went to King Louis IX of France. On April 4th, 1259, a 52-year-old Henry III knelt amid the gnarled trunks and wind-stripped branches of an apple orchard outside the palace of King Louis IX. En route to Paris, Henry III stopped at every church on his road to hear Mass. King Louis, 7 years younger than Henry, only gave Henry III rights to Gascony and his wife's lands in the Santonge and Angenay. During the ceremony, the English and French notables gathered at Sainte-Chapelle, which held Christ's crown of thorns. King Henry III went to his grave believing himself a Norman and an Angevin, but the world no longer pretended that English kings ruled most of France. And in a sign of this change, Lord Edward himself came to speak English far better than his father, speaking it alongside French and Latin. He also became the first king of England to see himself as English rather than Norman or Angevin. In short, the English royal family was becoming English 200 years after the Norman conquest. That wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.